the sea yard. There is a man standing in this yard that every single person inside Calipatria State Prison is afraid of. Not cautious around, not wary of, afraid of. The guards are afraid of him. The gang leaders are afraid of him. The men who came in with murder convictions and reputations that preceded them by years, they are afraid of him. He has been inside California's prison system for 20 years, and in that time, he has built something that most men spend their entire lives trying to build on the outside: total control. He wears an orange do-rag on his head every single day, not because the rules allow it, because the administration decided that the specific peace his authority maintained inside these walls was worth more than the enforcement of a uniform policy. The orange do-rag is not a fashion choice. It is a crown, and everyone in Calipatria understands exactly what it means. When one of his previous stabbing victims was asked by guards what happened, how he ended up with a puncture wound that needed medical attention, the man looked the officer in the eye and said he had been stung by a bee. A bee inside a maximum security prison yard. That is the level of fear this man generated in the people around him. His name is Eddie Eugene Clark. The streets called him the Devil. Inside Calipatria, they just called him what he was. And on this specific morning, he is walking across the sea yard toward a slim, quiet man who has spent years doing everything right, making his bed every morning, being prompt for count, spending his time in the law library instead of the weight pile. A man who is innocent, a man who should not be here at all. Clark reaches into his waistband, pulls out a flat, stainless steel sharpened to a point, drives it into the innocent man's side, leans close and whispers something, then drops the weapon in the grass and walks away like he has just made an ordinary request of an ordinary day. The guards see nothing. Those who might have, they already knew better. This is the story of the most dangerous prisoner in California. How he built a kingdom inside the most violent prison in the state. And the one man, the last man anyone would have expected, who ended it. Eddie Clark's story did not begin inside a prison. It began in South Central Los Angeles, in the specific geography that produced a generation of young men whose relationship with violence was formed before they were old enough to understand what violence actually cost. He entered the criminal justice system as a juvenile. His first serious offense, the one that told you everything about who Eddie Clark was going to become, was beating another teenager to death. Not a shooting, not a weapon pulled in the heat of a moment that escalated past what anyone intended. A beating. The sustained, deliberate physical destruction of another person. The kind of violence that requires you to continue past the point where any reasonable instinct tells you to stop. The kind of violence that tells you something fundamental about the man doing it. The juvenile system processed him, released him. He came back as an adult. This time the charges were robbery with violence, targeting people who could not defend themselves, leaving victims hospitalized, escalating the level of brutality each time as though the stakes of the previous offense had not registered at all. California sentenced him to decades in state prison. He entered the system as Edward Eugene Clark. He left each facility as something else entirely. By the time he arrived at Calipatria, by the time he planted himself in that sea yard and began the specific patient work of building dominance over 5,000 men, he had spent half his life inside California's correctional institutions. He understood how they worked at a molecular level. He understood the specific incentives that governed guard behavior, the specific fear hierarchies that governed inmate behavior, and the specific gap between official policy and daily reality that every maximum security prison generates, and that a sufficiently intelligent and sufficiently ruthless man can exploit completely. Eddie Clark was both of those things. Sufficiently intelligent and sufficiently ruthless. They called it Kilopatria. Calipatria State Prison sat in Imperial County near the Salton Sea, one of the most remote, most violent correctional facilities in the California state system. 5,000 men, 20 officers watching 1,000 inmates in the yard at any given time. A 50-to-1 ratio in an environment where violence was the primary currency, where physical dominance determined access to everything from safety to the most basic forms of dignity that incarcerated men can claim. Contraband moved through Calipatria the way money moves through a legitimate economy, in volume, with organization, with people at every level of the distribution chain who understood exactly what they were doing and what it cost if they got caught. The guards knew. The administration knew. The knowledge changed very little about what actually happened inside those walls. Into this environment, into Kilopatria, into 50-to-1 supervision ratios and daily violence that most people on the outside cannot fully imagine, Eddie Clark had spent years constructing something with no official name, but with total practical reality. A kingdom. He was a leader of the Crips inside Calipatria, but his power had long since transcended gang affiliation. 20 years inside California's correctional system had given him something that most men never fully develop: the specific intelligence of a man who has studied power for 2 decades in an environment where power is the only thing that matters, who understands exactly where the pressure points are, who knows which guards can be managed and how, who knows which inmates can be used and how, who knows where the system's official rules end and where his own authority begins. He worked in the kitchen. He used that access to accumulate resources, food, materials, the small advantages that inside a prison add up to significant leverage over the people around you. But as the years passed, something in Clark began to deteriorate. The violence that had always been part of how he operated became less calculated, more erratic. Men who had been around him for years began saying the same thing to each other in lowered voices. He was a time bomb waiting to go off. He was unpredictable in ways that even the men who benefited from his protection were starting to find difficult to be near. His temper, his paranoia, the way he could turn on someone who had done nothing wrong as easily as he turned on someone who had crossed him. The distinction between the two categories was becoming harder to track from the outside. And then there was the correctional officer. About 2 years after Clark entered Calipatria, he developed a relationship with Lisa Finch, a correctional officer who worked on his tier. Think about what that actually means inside a maximum security prison. A woman employed by the California Department of Corrections, trained to maintain control over the men in her custody, authorized to use force if necessary, part of the official authority structure that was supposed to govern every aspect of Eddie Clark's existence, operating in ways that served his interests instead of the institution's. The orange do-rag represented his power over inmates and guards alike. That was not metaphor. That was documented operational reality. The prison administration had ceded enough ground to this man that he had a guard on his tier whose loyalty ran toward him rather than toward the department she worked for. That is who Eddie Eugene Clark was. That is what he had built inside Kilopatria. A group of his own Hoover Crip brothers, men who had run with him, who had benefited from his authority, who understood better than anyone what he was becoming, attempted an intervention. It did not work. Reggie Cole arrived at Calipatria as a teenager, 18 years old, slim build, no reputation, a young man from South Central Los Angeles who had been convicted of a murder he did not commit, based on the fabricated testimony of a witness named John Jones, who was running an illegal operation at the time and could not afford the scrutiny of a full police investigation. John Jones told investigators what they wanted to hear. Arthur Jones, no relation, corroborated the story. Reggie Cole was convicted of first-degree murder. He was innocent. Inside Calipatria, he made his bed every morning. He was always prompt for count. He studied religion, trying to find peace in a place designed to produce none. He spent his free time in the law library, reading every document he could find, trying to understand how what had happened to him had happened. He was, in his own words, trying to figure out why God put him in prison for something he did not do. When Cole was placed on Eddie Clark's tier, Clark took him in as a younger homie. The same broad Crip affiliation created a temporary umbrella of protection for a young man who would otherwise have been immediately vulnerable. Cole had love and respect for Clark. He considered him his older homie. That changed. It started with a dart. Someone fired an 8-inch dart from a homemade slingshot at a correctional officer in the handball court. It missed. A weapon was found near Eddie Clark's cellmate when investigators searched the area. Clark needed someone to take the blame. He chose Reggie Cole. The logic was simple from where Clark stood. Cole was already serving life without parole. What was one more charge? What did it cost a man who was never getting out to absorb a weapons charge that would otherwise trace back to Clark's cell? Cole said no. It was the most dangerous word in Calipatria. For a month after that refusal, Eddie Clark nursed his grudge with the specific patience of a man who has spent 20 years learning that timing matters more than impulse. He watched, he waited. He let Cole move through his days with the terrible knowledge that something was coming without knowing exactly when. And then on the morning of November 28, 2000, the devil crossed the sea yard. He had a flat, a piece of stainless steel sharpened to a killing point. He drove it into Cole's side, leaned close enough that only Cole could hear what he said next, told him he was now his property, dropped the weapon in the grass, walked away. The guards saw nothing. 15 minutes. That is how long Reggie Cole had to decide who he was going to be for the rest of his life. He was innocent. He had not committed the murder that put him in this place. He had spent years doing everything right. The made bed, the count, the law library, the religion, trying to prove through sheer conduct that he did not belong inside Calipatria. None of it had gotten him out. And now the most feared man in Calipatria had just stabbed him in the side, whispered that he owned him, and walked away through a yard full of 50-to-1 guard coverage without a single official noticing. 15 minutes. Cole realized something that no amount of made beds or library hours had prepared him for. I was going to kill him, or he was going to kill me. Contrary to what people were talking about, that was my older homie, and I had a lot of love and respect for that dude. A correctional officer was frisking Eddie Clark on his way back in from the yard. Cole jumped over the officer's back and stabbed Eddie Eugene Clark. The devil died in the sea yard of Calipatria State Prison on November 28, 2000, 20 years inside California's correctional system. The orange do-rag that functioned as a crown. The guards who answered to him instead of over him. The inmates who said they had been stung by bees rather than say his name. The Crip brothers who tried and failed to stop what he was becoming. The time bomb that everyone around him knew was going off and that nobody had figured out how to stop. Gone. Killed by a slim, quiet man who had made his bed every morning and studied religion and spent his free time in a law library trying to understand why God had put an innocent man inside Kilopatria. At his funeral in Compton, with R. Kelly's I Wish playing as attendees filed through the doors, Eddie Eugene Clark was described as a legend who loved sports, fishing, camping, and dancing. Cole was now facing the death penalty. Here is the specific irony that defines this entire story. If Cole had not killed the devil, if he had not committed an act that elevated his case to a level where serious legal resources had to be devoted to it, nobody would ever have looked closely enough at his original conviction to find what was there. His death penalty attorney, Christopher Ploward, spent 5 years investigating. He found that John Jones's testimony was largely fabricated. He found exculpatory evidence that had never been disclosed to Cole's defense. He found a Los Angeles Times article from 1995 and a book published in 1997, both by journalist Miles Corwin, that documented the police investigation into Cole's case and pointed directly toward his innocence. Evidence that had been sitting in plain sight for years while Reggie Cole sat inside Kilopatria. In 2007, 7 years after Cole killed the devil, Judge Donald B. Donnelly ordered an evidentiary hearing. At that hearing, John Jones admitted on the stand that he had not told the truth to police. He had an illegal operation to protect. He told investigators what they wanted to hear. And Reggie Cole spent years inside Kilopatria for it. Judge Donnelly struck the underlying conviction. Cole received 10 years for the manslaughter of Eddie Clark, time he had already served many times over. The district attorney conceded to the habeas petition. The original murder conviction was vacated. In 2017, the city of Los Angeles settled his civil rights lawsuit for $5.2 million. Reggie Cole is free. He lives in South Central Los Angeles. He received a settlement that acknowledged what had been done to him. He has time back that can never be fully accounted for. He said something afterward that tells you everything about what it cost him to survive the thing that freed him. "I was innocent," he said, "and I still had to be a convict. That's something I gotta explain to God. This was a human being who had a family, and their family hurt just like mine did." Eddie Eugene Clark, the devil, 20 years inside California state prisons, a do-rag that functioned as a crown, a correctional officer who answered to him instead of the department that employed her, an entire yard of men who told guards they had been stung by bees rather than say his name, a Crip family that tried and failed to stop what he was becoming. Dead at the hands of the last man anyone inside Kilopatria would have predicted. A man who was innocent, a man who should never have been there at all.